Okay, well, welcome everyone to this evening's or this afternoon's, depending on where you're joining us from, meeting of the Anti-Racism Allies Network. You're very welcome from wherever you're joining from. And if you haven't done already, then do let us know in the chat where you are joining us from. It's always good to see where people are accessing our resources across the world. So I'm delighted to welcome Neil Charlton as well. He'll say perhaps a bit more about himself a little bit later for the topic this evening, which is fourth in our decolonisation series. You don't have to watch the previous ones to make any sense of this. Each of them stand alone. But if you want to access those, they're all those recordings are on our website at anti-racism allies.net. So my name is Adrian Locke. I'm the coordinator of the network, and I'll be just hosting the topping and tailing of the session this evening. So just to give you an overview of our agenda, a quick reminder of our purpose. We always do that right at the beginning so that you know why we're here, and hopefully you can buy into that purpose. Share a bit about the qualities of our spaces, in a sense, the ground rules that we like to agree in terms of how we have a conversation about what is a very emotive and very potentially triggering subject when we're talking about racism. So we'll talk about the qualities of our spaces. Very briefly, I'd just like to touch base with some items in the news which race and racism are relevant for or have appeared. But then the main event, if you like, for 40 minutes or more, I'll hand over to Neil, and there will be a chance for Q&A and discussion at the end of Neil's presentation as well. We'll then finish the evening at 9:30, when we will share what's next in 2026. And I'm really excited about our next session in July as well. So look forward to introducing you to that later. And then if you can stick around after 9:30, we turn the recording off. People often stick around and for a longer chat. It'd be great if you can stay with us, as many people often do. First of all, a reminder of our aims as a network. We say we are aspire to be true allies against racism because it's a journey that we're all learning to be on and to be better at. And it's the people that we desire to be allies with that can really judge whether we are. And we often touch base with our council of reference to check in on that, whether we are achieving that purpose. But basically, ARAN helps us to become true allies of people of colour, the global majority, in the fight against systemic and global injustice. And for those of us who are racialized as white, ARAN also helps us to learn about ourselves, our histories, our privileges, and our impact. To learn about people of colour, their histories, perspectives, and experiences, to develop ideas for action that we can take individually, collectively, and in partnership with others towards racial justice. Everyone is welcome in our meetings, both aspiring white allies and co-mentors. There's two forms of membership there. Neither do we ask for any money from you, but you can sign up. That just means that we keep you in touch with events if you sign up as one of those two types of member. And I was thinking the other day, I could actually summarize our strategy in three words. You know, you have those kind of three words to know your location in the country. Well, I was thinking, well, I think I can summarize our strategy in three words. First of all, is to educate. I suppose I have a belief that if we educate, if we actually learn about the issues, and if we learn about our histories, about the implications of that, and we fully embrace that, then the second part almost naturally follows, that we are motivated then hopefully to do something about it. But just having a motivation within, unless there's some action, means nothing at the end of the day. And so to educate, motivate, and activate, that's what we hope to do as part of this network in three short words. Okay, qualities of our spaces. These are the ground rules that we'd like you to sign up to. If you're not willing to, then maybe there's something else on TV you want to watch. But we do ask you to commit to these, and we do have the power to exclude people who do not meet these rules, if you like. So we want each of us to commit to be respectful and non-judgmental in our conversations this evening, being slow to make negative judgments, being aware of the intersectionality of experiences too, which adds a different nuance for people's experience of racism. We commit to being humble and curious too, allowed to own our ignorance, able to say sorry authentically when we unintentionally offend. being curious about views very different to our own, pausing before responding, particularly if we feel triggered in some way. We want to be mindful and heartful, careful, thinking before we speak, considerate in our contributions and language, emotional and empathetic, not rationalizing away other people's feelings, but also able to express our own feelings. I know part of my journey is to learn not to be defensive when someone says something which triggers me, and still a work in progress there. We also want to be open and authentic, able to speak our own truths, sharing our own experiences and perspectives, but also being courageous, open to challenge each other and to be challenged, the courage to confront ourselves and others. And we want to be confidential so that it's perhaps less relevant in this context, but when we've split into small groups in some sessions, we want people to be confidential to those spaces where something is shared. But finally, we want to be kind and other-centered, sensitive to each other's needs, building relationships first, recognizing that some people need more time and space than others to contribute. So we don't force anyone to contribute in any way. But finally, not to wallow in white guilt, recognizing that becoming an anti-racist is not about me and my guilt as a white person, about defending my ego in a sense, but about serving a greater cause of justice in the world. I think guilt could be useful as a transitory emotion if it motivates us to action, but wallowing in white guilt doesn't really do anyone any favors. So we want to avoid that. Okay, so briefly, race and racism in the news. I've just picked up a few things because I really want to get on to Neil's topic as soon as possible. But something that's come up, Reform UK candidates. Unfortunately, a number have been exposed for racist and Islamophobic and anti-Semitic comments. These are kind of fairly UK-centric news items. I apologise for those across the pond. We've actually focused quite a lot on some of the issues around Trump in the past, but today focus is on the UK. Yeah, so that's maybe it's not so much a surprise for those in the UK that that's come out, but yeah, that's certainly hit the news. And it'd be interesting to see how that impacts the next local elections. The UK government has defined anti-Muslim hate, and there's been a bit of controversy over that definition as well. It's a non-statutory definition to try and address rising hate crime. But something else that another minister has pointed out, Zubir Ahmed, has warned of a shift towards more extreme views on race and identity, citing the abuse that he personally receives and wider trends. And apparently, anti-Muslim hate makes up about 45% of religious hate crimes in England and Wales. I wouldn't be surprised if much of the rest of it is anti-Semitism, unfortunately, as well. There's a real polarization happening, isn't there, in our world, with people from many different walks of life and different polar opposites in the spectrum of race identity. Really, I don't know, just the whole hate speech issue is an increasing difficulty and problem in our societies across the world, not just in the UK. I could go on, but I want to move on. But before I introduce Neil and ask him to get into to our next session, those that know me and Laura, who's on the my wife Laura, who's on the call, well, will know that we're trying to move house and we're sorting through loads of stuff as part of that process. And I came across something in some of my mum's old memorabilia, something a little postcard from the 1930s, and this is what it had on it. And in many ways, when I looked at that, maybe this epitomizes the kind of view of Christianity that so many of us in the West have of this white missionaries almost becoming white saviors on behalf of Christ, bringing Christianity to a people that are both primitive and really don't know much about Christianity at all. But actually, I think what we'll learn tonight, there's a very different reality to that in terms of the origins of the religion of Christianity and some of the original meanings and theologies that were developed in the very earlier days of Christianity. But this postgraph of the 1930s maybe sums up an attitude that has been around for a long, long time. with a white Jesus behind the white missionary. But let me hand over to Neil now to take us into this topic, and I'm going to stop sharing my slides so he can share his. And really delighted that Neil can join us this time. For anyone who's experienced his sessions here before, and I think is it two you've done before, Neil? I think it's at least two, isn't it? They're always good value. So I'm really excited to give Neil this space now so that he can take us through this really important topic. So Neil, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me okay. It's good to be with you, and it's good to be able to share with you again. Thank you for the feedback on the screens. That's fantastic. Wonderful. I'm just going to put up my slides here. Okay, so it's like I said, great to be with you again. And once again, this is another massive topic. And I guess from the get-go, I need to say that there's no way on earth I can cover every aspect of what this topic represents tonight. And so, because it's, as you can imagine, it's quite huge. But I'm hoping to give a reasonable overview of the subject with some room, as Adrian mentioned at the end, for some Q&A questions, etc. So let me give you a little bit of a direction of where we're going, or direction of travel, is that I'm hoping to define what is colonized and decolonized Christianity and trace its elements of influence throughout history. And throughout my presentation, I'm hoping to cover some of the questions that were outlined in the invitation for this evening. So questions such as, what wisdom and practices have been lost from Christianity? How has colonial Christians shaped Christendom and today's church? And what might we rediscover by exploring this topic? So hopefully as I go through, I'm touching on some of these questions to some degree. And I guess it's probably informative to know that some of the material that I'm going to share tonight came out of my final dissertation in my theology degree at Spurgeon's. So some of you might be aware that's a theological college, which sadly has closed down in recent months. But I know I probably am not the only one on this Zoom call that has been to Spurgeon's and studied there. But part of my final dissertation was including some of the things I'm going to share tonight. And then obviously there's other elements that have come from several years of research and just being interested in this subject quite deeply. And so I do need to make a disclaimer. I think it's obvious, or maybe it's not obvious, but I am by no means an expert in this field. But what I have chosen to do is kind of lean on a number of diverse individuals who have an immense expertise on this area. So I've kind of picked up on their work, and hopefully I'll reference them and you'll pick up on that as we go through this presentation. So I have got a lot of material to get through, so I will be moving at a pace. So forgive me for that. But please jot down any questions you have, whether on paper or mentally. And then, like I said, at the end, hopefully we'll get a chance to have a little bit of a Q&A, and I will give all the questions to Adrian because he knows everything. Okay. So without further ado, I'm just going to get straight into this. So are you sitting comfortably? So firstly, I think to understand what we mean by colonized Christianity, I think it's important to understand what colonialism is. So some of you may know this already, but it's always good to be reminded that colonialism basically is the policy of a country seeking to extend or retain its authority over people or territories, and generally with the aim of economic dominance. And so colonizers may impose their religion, their language, their economics, and other cultural practices on indigenous peoples. That's what colonialism is all about. And so when we speak of colonial Christianity, which is the phrase I want to use a lot today, is that it's basically a form of Christianity which is intertwined and supportive of colonial power structures. And so it's like the two becoming one. It's the colonialism and Christianity coming together, intertwined in some way, shape, or form. And so colonialism has always been linked to a divine mandate. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, the theologian Jan Boer, for a Dutch theologian, he said, and I quote, "Colonialism is a form of imperialism based on a divine mandate and designed to bring liberation by sharing the blessings of the Christ-inspired civilization of the West with a people suffering under satanic oppression, ignorance, and disease, and seeking the benefits of both ruler and ruled." So that was his definition of what I'm calling colonial Christianity, because it had a divine mandate, and it sought to bring Christ-inspired civilization from the West to other parts of the world. And their aim was to bring benefit to both ruler and the ruled. And like I said, I'm encapsulating that into the phrase of colonial Christianity. And so the opposite of that is decolonialization, and spelt with the American way. But basically, decolonialization is then the critique of these theologies that arise through empire. It's a way of challenging some of those colonial systems, the narratives. It's putting a critical lens on some of the teachings and the practices that come out of colonial Christianity. And its focus is on centering in indigenous voices. So hopefully that will make sense as I go along further in my message. But I think since we got the definitions in place, I think it's a good place to start, because many people, scholars, believe that perhaps the starting point, the birth of colonial Christianity, was at the time of the Roman Emperor Constantine, who many claim to be the first Christian emperor, and he also Christianized, in a sense, the Roman Empire. There's a classic legend of him seeing a vision in the sky, and it was the sign of a cross, and that the voice came within the vision that in this sign of the cross you shall conquer. And so he went, like I said, Christianized the Roman Emperor, the empire, and used that as a kind of a mandate to go forth and do what he wanted to do. A well-known scholar by the name of Dr. Hendricks, he says that when the Roman Emperor Constantine declared himself the 13th apostle appointed by God, he transformed the faith that Jesus preached to the oppressed and institutionalized it as the official religion of the powerful empire that had executed Jesus. From that time throughout history, mainstream Christianity has had a virtually uninterrupted alignment with the powers that be. And so, again, it's just many scholars suggest that this was the beginnings of this kind of colonial Christianity through Emperor Constantine. But if we fast forward to the 1400s, so it's a bit of a jump, but if we fast forward, we find how Pope Nicholas V issues a number of bulls or decrees. And in 1452, for example, he gave the Portugal's king a specific mandate. And I'm going to quote that mandate verbatim. Well, not quite verbatim, because it would have been in Latin, but I'm going to read the English version. So he said that he empowered the Portuguese king to be able to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, which is Muslims, and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods, and to reduce their persons, so all people, to perpetual slavery. That was the mandate, that was the bull, that was the decree that the Pope Nicholas V gave to the Portuguese king. And in 1455, the same text was used, it was repeated almost verbatim, and another bull was given with the same wording. And in 1493, Pope Alexander VI, he issues another bull, which is called the Enter Cetera, which demanded, and I quote, "the Christian religion to be exalted and be everywhere increased and spread, that the health of souls be cared for, and that the barbarous nations be overthrown and be brought to faith itself. So all the pagans, these barbarous nations, must come to Christ according to this papal bull. And then we have from 1513 the Spanish conquistadors, which maybe some of you remember from school, but the conquistadors or conquerors that went to the islands to discover the indigenous people. And they were actually legally bound to read out an official proclamation in Spanish known as the request or the requirement. And it began by declaring that God created the heavens and the earth, that all humans were descended from Adam and Eve, and that the popes are ordained by God to lead the whole human race, and that the Pope donated these islands, the islands that they just discovered, to the Spanish crown. So can you imagine the indigenous people hearing this for the first time in a completely foreign language, by the way, because they're speaking Spanish. So I'm not sure the indigenous people understood that. But nevertheless, they were told this by the conquistadors when they came. And so the native people who heard this in a language that they probably couldn't understand were then ordered, and I'm going to quote verbatim what it says they were ordered to do. So the conquistadors said that they were ordered to acknowledge the church as the ruler and superior the whole. But if you indigenous people do not do this, then we shall powerfully enter your country and shall make war against you and shall subject you to the yoke of obedience to the church and their highnesses, which is the royalty. We shall take you, your wives, your children, and shall make you slaves of them. And we shall take away your goods, and the deaths and losses that shall accrue from this are your fault, not our fault, your fault, and not that of their highnesses, so not of the Spanish kings and queens, and not our fault or the soldiers' fault, but it's actually your fault. If you do not hear what we have to say, it's your fault. So that was the declaration they made as they entered the indigenous lands. So since the beginning of the Age of Discovery, European states have engaged relentlessly in the process of divesting indigenous peoples of their lands and sought to justify and legitimize this practice through the use of theological doctrines of discovery and occupation and conquest. This is the history of colonial Christianity. Now, hopefully you can see this image here, but these are the Tawassans. These are the Tawassans. These are the indigenous peoples of the British Columbia in Canada. And there's a really fascinating prophecy that were given to this indigenous people over 500 years old is this prophecy that I'm going to read to you from their peoples. It describes how one of their ancient holy men foretold that a people pale as birch, so white, would one day come across the great waters in large canoes. They would bring with them a black book, and the black book was truth, end to end, a gift of inestimable good. The people lived for many years waiting for the prophecy's fulfillment. And then one day it happened. They arrived. They teamed with people pale as birch. And yes, they brought with them a black book. Then the killings started. The Tawassans became an obstacle to the pale men, and the pale men slaughtered them. And those they didn't slaughter, they enslaved. This is the history of colonial Christianity. The great late Desmond Tutu says quite famously that when the missionaries came to Africa, they had the Bible and we had the land. They said, let us pray. When we closed our eyes, when we opened them, we had the Bible and they had the land. This is the history of colonial Christianity. And so there are a number of ways I believe that colonial Christianity has shaped Christendom and the world today. And I just want to outline 5. There are so many I could touch on, but I just want to outline 5. The first one is around anthropology. So colonial Christianity shaped anthropology. Yes, I'm using quite big words tonight, but hopefully you'll understand that anthropology is a study of humans and informs us how we understand human beings. So how we understand humans has been framed in large part by European theology and European biases. In parts of the global south, like Asia, Oceania, Latin America, North American, Indian, indigenous peoples, Africa, among others, there has been in history a framing of indigenous others as beyond the pale of civilization, or immediately designating them as subhuman, which obviously served the purposes of the European expansion into the non-Western world. Here's a classic image that was taken from a magazine in 1899. And the title of this image in that magazine was called The White Man's Burden. I'm not sure if you might have seen this before, but if you can see the image, there's two people. One, it represents the UK or John Bull, and the other gentleman is Uncle Sam, so represents the US, the United States. And in this picture, you can see that they're trying to deliver the world's people of color to civilization, which is on the top of the hill. If you can see right at the top of the hill, there's civilization there. And so America and the UK, the white man's burden is to take the people of color from barbarism, from oppression, from ignorance, from superstition, and bring them, lead them into the place of civilization. That was the white man's burden. And so why I share that is just to underline that the anthropology, the understanding of how they viewed Africans and other people of color as subpar, as people who needed to be brought into civilization. And many argue that this anthropological legacy, or how we view other people negatively at times, is still with us today. And I thought I'd highlight some examples here. This is a well-known media figure in the UK called Katie Hopkins. You might have heard of her. And she's speaking of migrants who are coming to the UK. And she said, make no mistake, these migrants are cockroaches. Now, not only is that a disgusting statement, but I think underlying that is an anthropological view. It's an anthropological perspective of others in that. I think that legacy has come down through the ages, and even, I would suggest, through colonial Christianity. Some of you might know this gentleman, and he has been known to have said, we have people coming into the country or trying to come in. You wouldn't believe how bad these people are. These aren't people. They are animals. So once again, a throwaway comment, but I feel that underlying that is a certain anthropological view of others that is present there. And then you might have heard of Netanyahu saying this struggle between the children of light and the children of darkness, between humanity and the law of the jungle. So there's a suggestion there that if Israel is representing humanity, then what are the Palestinians representing? Inhumanity? Again, might consider this a throwaway comment, but I feel that underlying this is a certain anthropological viewpoint. I'm going to move on to my second point. I think colonial Christianity shaped epistemology, another big word. Epistemology is just a study of knowledge, how we know things. And so the knowledge system, the epistemologies of the non-Western world have a history of being disparaged and ignored. So Western European theology in the local theology of Europe is known globally as mainstream theology, whereas everything else, Black theology, Latin American theology, Asian theology, indigenous theology, is generally relegated to contextual theology. So one is main theology, mainstream, and the other is contextual. And again, there's a kind of a distinction is made. I remember in my early days at Spurgeon's College, very, very early days, I remember challenging the lecturer at one point on why we don't use more non-European theological references or non-European reading material. And the response I remember getting was fairly dismissive at the time, and there was more of a far more focus on European theologians than on any other type of theologians. And I thought that was a bit of a shame because I thought that they missed out on some of the voices that were present in other people groups. And within colonial Christianity, European spirituality, for example, is seen as standard and good, while non-Western spiritualities and traditions are viewed as superstitious, primitive, even evil. I don't know if you know what this is, but I'll explain. So in northern Cameroon, many people keep a jar that represents their ancestors in a prominent place in the household. And it's called the pra, P-R-A. And the pra indicates the continuing life of those that have gone on before, whether that's a deceased member of a family or the wider community whose lives they are still expressed in through living people. So it's a way of remembering past members who've gone on. And the history to this is that when the people in Cameroon converted to Christianity, many Christian clergies called on the converts to destroy their pras as an expression of faith. So they told them, if you really want to follow Christ, you need to smash, break your pra. And so, like most Western Christians, the missionaries did not associate reverence for ancestors with Christianity. They regarded the spiritual knowledge or epistemologies and practice of Africans as superstition and something that should be destroyed and left behind. Now, in recent decades, the Christian case for reverencing, I say reverencing, not worshipping, reverencing ancestors. There's lots of Christians around the world now that have made a forceful argument of how indigenous cultures like Cameroon can use some of these things and hold on to some of these things and not necessarily destroy these things. And that it can actually work alongside and be evidence. Some of this can be actually evidence in the Hebrew scriptures as well. And so I believe that much ancient wisdom and practices have been lost from Western Christianity due to European epistemological biases. I mean, for example, I was just thinking, can you imagine if someone like me came into one of your homes and perhaps you had an urn that had the ashes of a loved one, and I told you that you need to smash that, break it into pieces? How would you feel? Don't need to answer that question. Some have also argued that Western epistemology tends to favor abstract logic over lived experiences, which may explain why, in general, Western theologians were historically great at writing about systematic theology, but poor at exercising systematic justice. And the late, great Dr. James H. Cone, incredible, prolific writer on this subject, he said, it's hard not to conclude that the main reasons Western theologians have said little that can be used in the struggle of oppressed is due to the fact that they have been only spectators and not victims of suffering. It's a generalization, but I think he was trying to make the point that in this writing, in this particular book, he was actually making the point that sometimes if you look at the theology in Western theology, the history, you generally focused on the divinity of Christ. So it focused on the power of Christ, the rulership of Christ, the authority of Christ, and less on the humanity of Christ. So his humility, his willingness to give up power and privilege, his willingness to love the poor, the oppressed, even his enemies. And so there was this focus on the divinity of Christ rather than the humanity of Christ, because, Cone argues, because Western theologians, for the most part, spoke from a position of privilege, not from a position necessarily of suffering. And so, as Cone writes elsewhere, he says, what people think about God, Jesus Christ, and the church cannot be separated from their own social and political status in a given society. He was emphasizing the point of positionality. So where somebody is in society, their position in society, often determines the type of theology they emphasize. And so it's no surprise that Eurocentric theology emphasizes, the rulership and power and authority and those things, historically speaking. So Western epistemologies tend to also favor a secular sacred divide. And this sadly allowed colonial powers to use theology to save souls while simultaneously using secular law to steal land, genocide indigenous peoples, and enslave bodies, claiming the two realms were separate. And that's quite different from global majority epistemologies or ways of knowing. They don't tend to have such rigid dichotomies. The late Reverend Dr. Barbara Holmes said that the erasure of belief systems and practices was intentional and almost complete. When Western missionaries went into places like Africa and other places, there was almost like an intentional practice to get rid of all other cultures. Some have described this as epistemicide, the systematic killing or silencing and devaluing of the knowledge system of others. I think that's quite a strong word. And so the intentional delinking of ourselves from unhelpful Eurocentric epistemologies, such as, for example, the sacred secular divide, is a form of decolonializing ourselves when we try and challenge these things that are unhelpful. Third, culture. I think colonial Christianity shaped culture. These cultures, pre-existing Europe by thousands of years, were often minimized, demonized, and supplanted. Colonial Christianity led to its own ethnic and cultural exceptionalism. So, as was described in that picture that I showed before of the white man's burden, there was almost this belief that Western culture was the best culture, was the most holy culture. And as the late Native American Christian theologian, Dr. Richard Twiss, said, and I quote, many Western missionaries over the past few centuries have couched the gospel in their own cultural distinctives, language, musical instruments, housing structures, as though these preferences were biblical or holy, often declaring outright that cultural preferences of indigenous peoples were in fact unbiblical and unholy. And that was his perspective as a Native American Christian. And so with this level of cultural exceptionalism, it's no wonder that the British European Christians would inevitably seek to dominate and destroy the culture of others. If you have this innate understanding that you're better, your culture is the better than every other cultures, then it surely follows that you're going to be okay with removing other cultures. It just goes hand in hand. And so it's no wonder that also that in this dominant culture that Jesus is depicted as white. This is an image that I grew up with as a child, and it was on the wall. In fact, in most Jamaican households, which I was raised in, most Caribbean households had this kind of image in their house. It was part of the culture. Most Christian households I knew when I was growing up had also this picture of a white Jesus on their wall. This was part of the culture. And so the dominant culture presented their view of Jesus and we accepted it as good and holy. Yet, when other culture preferences are brought forward, they're considered unbiblical or unholy. And I think that still happens to this day. I found this article. Now, observe the framing of this. The title of this Christian blog post, by the way, says what to do with a spooky African mask. And like I said, this is written by a Christian lady. And she said the following in this article. During my house search a few years back, I went to a home and that had about a dozen of these garish looking African masks on the wall in the living room. My agent didn't know if the masks were real or not, but I didn't care. The sight of them was just plain creepy, and I was unable to take a serious interest in the place. So she didn't buy the house or purchase the house because of these African masks that were in the house. But there's more. She went on to say about these African masks that we should not have any objects in our home that have been associated with magic rituals. They should be sprinkled with holy water, then removed from the house and destroyed, preferably by burning and the ashes scattered in a local stream or creek. I don't know how you think about that or what you think about that, but interestingly, just to note that I have, and I'm actually looking at them right now, I have 2 of these such African masks in my home today. And surprisingly, I have not yet burned them or scattered their ashes in my local river Wandor, and I don't intend to. Part of what it means to decolonize Christianity is to challenge some of these dominant colonial Christian narratives. Not necessarily the core message of Jesus, that's not the point, but to the cultural preferences of those who present those messages sometimes. So this is a Dutch photographer. He did some research and archaeological investigation, and obviously looking at the people in the region of the Middle East. He did an AI rendition or depiction of what Jesus may have possibly looked like, and he came up with this. And for me, depictions like this help to reshape our cultural understanding. I think that depictions like this help to decolonize us from dominant colonial Christian epistemologies. And I wish I had such images like this when I was growing up as a child. Fourthly, colonial Christianity shaped ecology. Colonial Christianity had and has implications not just for human bodies and lives, but also for the land, the air, the sea, and all the creatures of God's creation. Events such as the discovery of the Americas and the transatlantic slavery trade did not just affect human bodies, they significantly reshaped the land and the animals in total opposition to the indigenous peoples who championed the interconnectedness of life and being one with the land. I'm not sure if you are aware of this, but in 1934, the American Indians lost roughly 80 million acres of land. Let me say that again, 80 million acres of land, and nearly 2/3 of the American Indians became landless and unable to meet subsistence needs due to colonial Christianity. The late American historian, Dr. Lynn Townsend White, he argued quite strongly in this particular study that modern ecological crisis was mainly or primarily due to the dominance of the Christian worldview in the West. Which he saw as anti-ecological, hostile towards nature, and imposed a division between humans and the soul, with attitudes towards exploiting nature in an unsustainable way. He concluded and this is quite a strong statement, he concluded that the Western Christianity bears a substantial burden of guilt for the contemporary environment crisis. Let me say that again. Western Christianity, in his opinion, bears a substantial burden of guilt for the contemporary environmental crisis. And there's quite a fascinating and yet really disturbing study that I read, which is up on the screen, by University College of London in 2019. They found quite something really, really disturbing, that European colonialization of the Americas resulted in the killing of so many native people that it transformed the environment and resulted in the human-driven global impact on the Earth system. So it not only took lives, it affected the ecology. And it goes on to say that in the 2 centuries prior to the Industrial Revolution, it indirectly contributed to a colder period, which caused the deaths of approximately 56 million people by 1600s. I don't know about you, but I find that mind-blowing. And that these are the unintended consequences, I believe, of colonial Christianity on our ecology. Fifthly, colonial Christianity shaped violence. By this, I mean the persistent physical violence perpetrated towards the marginalised, the colonised, in the name of God. And I believe that this violence was not just colonial, it was theological. It was fueled by a particular perspective, a particular theology, formulated, inherited, perpetuated, and violently exercised through a Eurocentric view. Pope Leo VIII, he wrote a mandate to the missionaries who were heading towards Africa to minister to Africans. And he wrote this in 1890, and I'm going to read verbatim. He says, besides protecting freedom, another more serious apostolic concern orders us to spread the teaching of the gospel in Africa. This teaching should bathe those inhabitants living in darkness and blind superstition with the light of divine truth. We are the more concerned about this because those who have received this light have also shaken off the yoke of human slavery. Wherever Christian customs and laws are in force, there neither slavery nor savage barbarism can exist. Rather, mildness of character and civilized Christian liberty flourish there. So he was suggesting that if Christianity is brought to Africa, then mildness of character and civilized Christian liberty should flourish. King Leopold II of Belgium, which some of you may be familiar with, he was actually inspired by that Pope's mandate to go to Africa. And he viewed himself, King Leopold viewed himself as a Christian philanthropist. And in the official documents of correspondence, Leopold promised, and I quote, to suppress slavery and protect the natives. That's what he said in a letter. Whereas many of us know, and I'm sorry for the graphic image here, but under Leopold's rule, it is estimated that around 10 to 15 million Africans died, caused by forced labor, violence, disease, starvation, amputation, as you can see on the screen here, complete barbarism. Today, I believe the legacy of colonial Christianity is still with us. I think there are entities and empires that continue to lean on their theologies as a justification for violence or genocide. I think, and you may disagree with me, but I think an example of this is Trump. He uses certain theology, understandings of the Christian thinking to motivate, to inspire, and to do what he intends to do. And I don't think he's the only one, but I think it's he has used it. I think Netanyahu, although he's not a Christian per se, but I think he's also used scripture and he's used theology as a vehicle to inspire and encourage others to do damage in places like Palestine and other countries. And I think there's a growing movement. It has been here for a couple of decades now, known as Christian nationalism, which I think is a legacy of colonial Christianity. But there's an irony here, because I think one of the greatest ironies about colonial Christianity is that not only were people colonized, but Christianity itself was colonized. I believe the teachings of Jesus was co-opted and corrupted by powerful and privileged people. I think the original teachings of Christ were hijacked, misappropriated by violent empires, and I still think it happens today. I refer to Dr. Hendricks again, who says Christianity has been hijacked by empire, but Christ calls us back to liberation. So colonial Christianity was never really concerned with the liberation of Native Americans. I don't think colonial Christianity was ever really concerned with the liberation of the First Nation peoples. I don't think colonial Christianity was ever really concerned with the liberation of Africans during the scramble for Africa after abolition. And I stress that fact about after abolition. And here at this point, I might say something quite controversial, so feel free to take me up on it later. But I find it interesting how Christians and Christian nations are very quick to pat themselves on the back for their involvement in abolitionism. And they tend to forget that straight after abolitionism, in the very same century, was the scramble for Africa, where there was untold violence done, untold exploitation, untold suffering done in the very same century after the abolition of slavery. I often hear it in the conversation and arguments of how Christians really applaud, and I do, the fact that abolition happened. But they tend to forget that straight after that was the scramble for Africa. The Reverend Dr. Charlton Turner says that theology must be continually interrogated for its deeply embedded reliance on systems of power and violence originating from imperial, economic, nationalistic, and political systems. And so I believe that this continual interrogation is part of what it means. It's the heart of what it means to be a decolonizing Christianity, continually analyzing, continually critiquing, and continually challenging narratives. So, what may we discover or rediscover if we continue to do this work of decolonizing Christianity? I believe that by challenging and critiquing the history of dominant Eurocentric narratives, such as colonial Christianity, then we can begin to build a different picture. And so it challenges some of the narratives that have come down through our understanding of anthropology, our understanding of epistemology, our understanding of ecology. These things can be unpacked through understanding and hearing the voices of our global majority Christians. And I think part of that is the key. I think the key is to be willing to listen to the many other theological views, points, and voices from non-Western Christians, as well as Western Christians, but others as well. In my final dissertation, my theological dissertation for Spurgeon, this was the piece of work that I did. And I argued, you don't have to read all of this, by the way, I argued in the yellow for a polycentric Christian orthodoxy. And that's a very fancy way of basically saying to rediscover a globally centered rather than a Euro-American centered Christianity, where the global majority theological voice is heard and respected as equally as other voices. I think there's been a general understanding across the decades as time has gone on that other voices need to be heard. We can't just stick with a mono voice. We need poly voices. We need many voices to be able to flesh out what the faith means. And as Dr. Barreto says, that if we understand what polycentric Christianity would mean, it would mean to prioritize underrepresented and marginalized communities of faith, resulting in a greater degree of attention being paid to Asian, African, and Latin American experiences, the experiences of the marginalized communities in the North Atlantic world, and the experiences of women throughout the world as well. We need to be willing to listen to other voices, not just Eurocentric or American voices on certain issues. I think colonial Christianity never prioritized these other voices. I think colonial Christianity only prioritized its own voice. And so that's the work of what it means to be decolonize. It's to seek and include other voices. And I think I will end with this particular slide. This is a famous scene that some of you will know of Jesus apparently turning over the tables in the temple in the gospel narrative. And for me, this really unpacks or kind of explains a little bit of what we are trying to do when we are decolonizing colonial Christianity. The reason why I said that, well, because the basic reason why Jesus was turning over tables was that the moneylenders had occupied the space that was meant to be for non-Jews to pray and to worship God. And you could say that the moneylenders had colonized this space. And this angered Jesus so much that he effectively decolonized the space. He got rid of those things that shouldn't have been there so that it could be used for its rightful purpose, so that many others, not just Jews, but many others could be able to be included in the worship of God. And again, like I said, I think this picture really kind of illustrates what decolonizing Christianity means. It's about removing unhelpful narratives, unhelpful views, unhelpful practices that seem to hinder the voices of many others outside the usual dominant voices. Now, like I said, I could go on for ages, and I haven't probably not scratched the surface of this issue or this topic, but I'm going to end there, and then we can have an ongoing conversation.
Neil, thank you so much. As usual, incredibly rich presentation and an overview, and you've made the case really strongly for how, as initial expressions of Christianity, dominated and just subsumed and destroyed really many cultural perspectives at those early stages. I just wondered, before I open things up to questions from across the piece, and feel free to flag up in the chat if you'd like to ask a question, or just put your hand up on the screen in terms of the react buttons. I wonder whether you could say anything more, Neil, about the way our theology is kind of missing something today in the West. Can you say some more about that in terms of, if we were to embrace what some of the original North African early church fathers were kind of their emphasis? What is there something from that you can just open up to us? I wonder, in a few minutes.
Yeah, I think I referred to this, and hopefully you've got the slides, but some of the resources that I've included, if anybody wants to follow up on it, I have some resources on the end of the slides, and one of them is from.
Do you want to share those? Share
yeah.
once again, and let's have a look at those before we
bring it up.
open things up.
Yeah. So yeah, I quickly talk to this and then talk to your point actually. Just I think some of the things that are really helpful to have and that perhaps we've missed is because we have not had as much of the indigenous voices as we could possibly have in the room. Um, and when we do have that, we have a kind of a broader picture, a broader understanding of some of the spiritualities that they bring to the table, which is in line with the scripture, by the way. We're not talking about beyond scripture. But some of the resources that might help in this regard is things like the Global Bible Commentary, which is written by over 71 different scholars from across Asia, Africa, Pacific, Latin America. And it's just giving a different perspective of scriptures with all of those voices in the room rather than just one or two voices in the room. And I guess some of the, I think I'll get to that in a bit, but there's Latin perspectives as well that kind of touch on this and their understanding of Christianity. There's Native American understandings and what they bring to the table as well. There's Mexican understandings, what they bring to the table. There's even organizations that actually are still fighting to this day to challenge this doctrine of discovery, which is the mandate that was given to the Catholic Church to, go and dominate other nations. And so they're constantly challenging that. I think that is part of the decolonizing Christianity, is to challenge some of these ongoing narratives um, and ways of understanding when we read the scriptures. Because as a famous author, Chimamanda Ngozi, I think her name is, she said there's a danger in a single narrative. So if we only have a single narrative, single story, then we're in danger of not seeing the whole picture. As the common saying goes, there's always two or three sides to every story, right? So it's really good, I think, to have a multiple voices to hear that full story. And this is what I wanted to get to kind of address your question, Adrian. This Dr. Barbara Holmes, which I referred to in my talk, she wrote a book called Joy Unspeakable, and she brings out elements of contemplative practices that are not just experienced in Black churches, but beyond Black churches. So this is not just a Black thing. This is beyond that. But she emphasizes actually that there are different expressions that we could bring to the mix that sadly has been missed. And she talks about, communal things done together. I think the emphasis in the West historically has been that, for example, when we're doing contemplative stuff or where we're going to meditate and reflect on God and hear his voice, sometimes that can be quite an individualistic thing. She challenges that and says that actually in indigenous spiritualities, it's very communal. It's a communal thing. So instead of necessarily going off to seek God by oneself, it can be a kind of a communal aspect as well. I'm not suggesting that there's no place for seeking God by yourself. We know, actually, if we study scripture, we know that Jesus did that as well. But I think she makes the argument that actually there's many different ways to do this, and actually to focus on other forms of spirituality. So things that perhaps the West in their epistemologies have considered not very sacred, like dance, like even she suggests jazz music, blues, tap dancing, drumming, hip hop. I mean, that question at the end might even challenge your way of thinking. I wonder if that question at the bottom challenges your thought. Because for me, when I first came across it did challenge me to think that actually I do keep things in a very sacred secular two world dichotomy, when actually indigenous cultures and ancient cultures, even actually Jewish culture, don't do that. I don't know if that answers your question partly.
Thank you, Neil. Well, as usual, I always like to give you topics that are impossible to cover in one evening, because I know you're up for the challenge. But there's so much more I'm sure that we could you could expand on in these. But thank you so much for what you have shared. Let's open it up now for about 15 minutes or so, while we're recording, for anyone to ask questions or add comments. If you can keep your contribution reasonably concise. That means as many people as possible can contribute. I'm going to draw things to a close at about 25 past, talk about the next session. We'll then turn the recording off and we'll continue online for a period if you'd like to stick around and ask some more questions. But have we got any questions? I haven't seen any. Wynette, yes, Wynette and Eliane as well. So Wynette first and then Eliane.
Thank you, Neil. You've opened my eyes to a lot of things in this short space of time. Um, One thing I wanted to ask you is the backbone. Right through your talk, there are warnings, that we need to heed, and I wonder what happens if they are not heeded. Where do you see world Christianity going? Is there a brick wall or a precipice ahead of us if we carry on the way we are?
That's a very strong question. Um, I'm going to share something, but maybe not everyone will agree with this. But I suggest if you're familiar with the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, many scholars have suggested that actually when the Apostle John writes that book, which is ascribed to him, that he talks to 7 churches at the time. But also scholars suggest that these 7 churches represent churches throughout time. So it's both and. It's not just speaking to the churches at the time, but also throughout time. And it's interesting that it seems, according to that pattern of what John presents, there's an arc where some churches become gradually worse and others don't. Does that make sense? If you read the narrative of those 7 churches, there are some that actually get gradually worse, and some that do repent, some that don't repent. And I think there's something in that for us today, in regards to the direction of the church for us today, that maybe there will be a part of the church that Christianity or colonial Christianity or Christian nationalism that actually don't repent and will cause more damage than good.
Eliane first and then Peter.
Great. That was a great talk. Thank you so much, Neil, for sharing. I have a couple of questions, but I think I'll limit it to just one this time for now, and then maybe I'll do it after. Where can I find all the recordings of these sessions?
I can answer that on the Anti-Racism Allies Network website. And so that's the email address is anti-racism allies.net.
Thank you so much.
Anti-racism, one word, allies.net. If you go to the events page, I think it is, then all the recordings are there. All the links are. Yeah.
And resources?
Resources, well, the resources Marnie's been very helpful in putting a list of some of those resources in the chat there, but we have
there it is.
We have a resources page as well, which these will be added to. It's a Padlet board. I don't know whether you're familiar with Padlet boards or not, but we have about over 400 different resources on there. If you register on the website, then you can have free access to all of those resources, which are a mix of videos and books and articles, and even some spoken words and different performances there as well. So that's all, and I'll make sure that Neil's list is up there as well.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thanks, Eliane. Peter?
Good evening, Neil. Thank you. It's a very powerful indictment that you've brought of the impact of Western colonialism and the collusion of the church and the cooperation of the church in that process. Now, clearly, there were some African countries which had a Christian culture very much prior to any kind of Western impact. But I remember going to Malawi as a 22-year-old, living there for 2 years, and I think most of the Christian influence in Malawi had come from Christian missionaries from the West. And there seemed to be a church which was very respectful of and grateful for a Christian missionary input, and in some ways perhaps too reliant on those Western ways of worshipping and working, but also an indigenous religious culture, part of which seemed to me to be manifestly evil in many ways in terms of what it was espousing, the kind of culture it was bringing into parts of Malawi, and the church taking a very strong stand against that. And there didn't seem much space between those two kind of worldviews, a sort of Western-inspired Christian church in Malawi and a sort of indigenous culture which felt anti-Christian in many ways. I would guess now a lot of Malawian theologians have developed over the period since then, and there's been a development of thinking which has allowed a sort of development of an indigenous African theology in that context. But I'd be interested in your comments on whether that Western sort of missionary effort in Malawi, as it were, should be seen as a good thing, notwithstanding some of the baggage that it brought with it.
Yep, that's a great question. And yeah, I would, like I said, I think there's a difference in my understanding between colonial Christianity and Christianity. I think there has been missionaries who've been able to impart the wisdom of the teachings of Christ without imposing incredible shifts and change in the indigenous cultures, or deaths or suffering. I think that has existed. I've kind of referred to in my presentation a number of, for example, Native American Christians. Someone obviously had spoken to them or come to their indigenous communities and shared the word of God with them. I'm thinking of Dr. Richard Swiss, who's received Christ through missionaries. And so, yes, I think we can say there are those who have brought the gospel without the baggage, without the colonial baggage. But sadly, I think the vast majority of history presents one that has been where colonialism has actually done quite a bit of damage. And I'm using that, I'm saying that quite lightly, but it's, as you saw in the presentation, it's done quite a number of things in different cultures over the centuries. And so I can't put the baby out with the bathwater, because, like I said, I think the core of Christianity and the message of Jesus Christ has changed individuals' lives. And I think that there has been a growing base of indigenous theologians that are coming to the fore over the last few decades. It's been a slow rise, but there are many people saying now that they are beginning to develop and grow and flourish. And as they do, they begin to kind of make a bigger presence in their indigenous communities around the world.
Thank you. I think my sense was that almost you can't split those two up between those who are good and those who weren't so good, as it were, because they all felt like a bit of a mixture. That I think a lot of the missionaries came with very genuine objectives to bring the gospel, but they also brought with them a lot of Western baggage, and perhaps that was inevitable.
I like what you said, though, in a sense of that a lot of, we are aware that some of these African communities, and particularly, received Christianity long before the push from the popes and the Catholic Church. And so there was a kind of, it's interesting to see the development of the Christianity from the 1st century onwards in those African, in the continent, and how it's survived. Particularly, I'm thinking of Ethiopia and how that was a country that was never colonized, and the way that Christianity is developed there has been quite interesting.
Thank you.
Okay, I think Suzanne first, and I think if Pierre's back in, he dipped out for a little bit, and I think Pierre will come second. But Suzanne and Brett. Hi, Brett.
Hi. Neil, is it? Hi, Neil. Yeah, I'm impressed. Well done. I'll tell you for why. Because I'm almost self-taught, and I'll tell you why. I was recently baptized 5 years ago, Pentecostal church, West Indian background, picture on the wall, yeah, the whole 9 yards. Now, a chap came to me one day and said, wasn't it a good thing that we had slavery? And I said, why on earth would you say such a thing, a black guy in a Pentecostal church? And his reasoning was, had it not been for slavery, we wouldn't know Jesus. And that worried me terribly, but it also caused me to then go and do my own research. And this is how I became familiar with the papal bulls, the Nicene Creed, Constantine, all these things I'd grown up hearing, but never really paid much attention to it. But obviously now these things take on a different significance now that I know better. So for instance, the papal bull given to the Portuguese, the age of discovery, 12 million blacks transported to Brazil. There are more blacks in Brazil than anywhere else on the face of earth. And all these things have happened, and with when the Europeans came and took us, as you say, well, you haven't said it, but I'm going to say it, but they imposed their religion on us. We don't have to, this isn't rocket science. We only have to look at our names. There is no tribe in Africa by the name of Brett Simpson. Simpson is a Scottish name. Where did Simpson come from? Neil Charlton. Where in Africa will you find a tribe with that name? It's not, so these things, when you have a certain understanding, it's quite easy, to get to grips with it. But and I'll end on this. My question to you is, knowing what you know, and I guess it applies to me as well, knowing the things that we know, how do we square being a Christian today, bearing in mind that we know the history, we know where this has come from, and in some ways, I'm going to say it, what that chap said to me, there is a ring of truth about it, but he's right, but he's right for the wrong reason, if you really think about it. Because what he's actually saying, without realizing, is that but for the fact that the Portuguese turned up with ships and then shipped us off to America or the West Indies, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now.
I partly agree and I partly disagree, and I think I touched on this a little bit, and this is a whole nother presentation, but long before, as I said before, long before the Portuguese arrived and the missionaries came, Christianity was in the continent, both north and south of the continent. And this, I can unpack that another day. But I agree that there's the reality of that through slavery, a lot of them were, you could argue, forcefully baptized. I remember reading some of the original narratives of some of the enslaved and how they were taken off the ships, lined up into the local church, and instantaneously baptized, and suddenly they became Christian. So that happened, but also I do believe they were genuine amongst that as well. They were genuine people who accepted Christ, and the legacy of that still is with us today. And so there was pre-slavery believers and the post-slavery believers, or during slavery believers. Did that make sense?
Yeah.
I could spend ages talking about this, and probably we should talk offline about that.
Yeah, and I do need to just draw things to an official close and turn the recording off, but we'll keep this conversation open. If you can stick around for longer, that'd be fantastic. But let me just briefly share my screen so that I can share what's coming up next for the Anti-Racism Allies Network. I'm delighted that we have assembled a really fantastic panel for our next session when we're looking at Decolonisation Part 5, a fair cop, ? Decolonising our police and justice systems. My goodness, we like to be ambitious here, don't we? Countless reports over 30, 40 years have called for change, but how can real change be achieved? We've got Jackie McKenzie from Lee Day. She was the Windrush lawyer that gave us a great session on the Windrush scandal a couple of years ago. We've got Clement Akuzi, related to some people on the line this evening, from the Met Race Action Plan, and just had a confirmation from Dr. Shireen Daniels, author of the Anti-Racist Organisation, and probably one of the most recent reviews of racism within the Met, 30 Patterns of Harm, a structural review of systemic racism within the Met. She's for me, one of the clearest thinkers of just recognizing the systemic nature of racism in our organizations. And so I'm delighted we've got a great panel lined up for the 8th of July. And then later in October, that's our final session of 2026, we'll be intensely practical. How can we be effective anti-racism allies? How can we learn from the past anti-racism action and examples of effective allyship? And what did they do that made a difference? And what can we learn from them? Hosted and organised by Angela Young, one of our steering group, who sends her apologies. She can't be here this evening. So that's the final two programmes for the year. All meetings will be, as this one has been, on Zoom at 8 to 9:30. So put those dates in your diary. If you have signed up as a member, then you will be sent details of these automatically through our mailing list. So if you'd like to be kept in touch with these, and when it goes on Eventbrite, then do sign up as a member. And also just emphasize our resources page. This is the Padlet board. This is a picture of it, a screenshot of it. Loads and loads of resources there. And we have one specifically on this topic, which I've every time we have a topic like this, I set up a new column to cover that. And so have a look on the resources there. You just need to register on the website for that. That's in terms of the official session this evening. Do stick around if you possibly can, and I'll turn the recording off.